inclination is going to be to go to Great Gatsby. And Great Gatsby is really good for talking about sort of this naked search for wealth of the 1920s, this glorification of wealth of the 1920s. But what I hesitate, what I fear is that you all will exaggerate and believe that everybody lived that life, when we probably had 5% of Americans at most living the life of Gatsby. So make sure you understand that. We do have more people living in towns and cities than we have people living on farms. First time in American history, so that's important. We begin to have highway systems during this time, and with highway systems, and I don't want you to think interstate or anything, I'm talking about 2 lanes, paved roads, but with that comes trucking. What are ramifications of trucking on our society? Well, that happened with trains, but even more variety, okay? It's not something new, but even more variety. We can have more fresh foods, and particularly with the idea of refrigerated trucks. We have refrigerated railroad cars already, but refrigerated trucks. It is cheaper, absolutely. Just think about putting something on the truck and taking it from the factory, from the Campbell Soup factory. I used to have to take it to the train depot, put it on a train, ship it somewhere, and then now I can put it in a truck and drive it straight to the AMP in Conway, South Carolina. Does that make sense? That's another ramification. We begin to get chain stores, particularly chain grocery stores. AMP is one of them, A and P. I don't know what that stands for, what they stand for, but that was the first major supermarket chain. And by supermarket, they would have been tiny by today's standards. Kroger is also an early chain out in the West that we have here today. So we begin to have those as a result of highways. The 1920s, similar to the 1980s, is an era in which our leaders believe in supply-side economics. This is what supply-side economics is. It is a belief that if you put regulation and taxes on the upper class, on the industrialists, that money that would have gone into taxes, or that money that you were having to spend on minimum wage or environmental regulations, not environmental in the 20s, but today. But a supply-side economics believes if you lower regulations and lower taxes on the industrialists, that they will make more money, and that money will then be filtered into more jobs. The more jobs we have, the stronger our economy is, right? Does everybody get supply side?
Is that like trickle down?
I was getting ready to ask that question. What did Ronald Reagan call this? Trickle down economics. What did his primary opponent in the 1980 election, George Herbert Walker Bush, call it? He called it voodoo economics. He said there's no such thing, that it's not going to trickle down, that the wealth stays there. So that's an example of that. What was the name of the Secretary of the Treasury in the 1920s who proposed this plan? It was called Blank's Tax Cuts in the 1920s. Andrew Mellon, M-E-L-L-O-N. He had made billions. He was a protege of Andrew Carnegie and had made his money through U.S. Steel. And he was a believer in supply-side economics. Tell me why, and I'm getting ahead of myself from the 20s, but why did supply-side economics fail in the 20s? Why didn't it trickle down? What? Well, number one, that's another problem that led to the Depression, but that's not a problem of supply side. Absolutely. There's a lack of all kind of regulation. Corporations can lie to their stockholders. They can water their stock. They can treat their workers poorly. And we're getting into causes of the Great Depression. One of them is the failure of supply side economics. Did you have it? She got it? They were, or where were they putting their money? And where else? In stocks. Remember that they were putting that money in stocks, and the prices of stocks kept going higher and higher and higher and higher, and then other people were borrowing money to buy stocks to go up and up and up. So those are failures. So there wasn't enough distribution of that money. Let me see what else I need to know on the 20s. Let me talk about new technologies in the 20s. We talked about highways. We get radios. Radios have been invented earlier, but we get the first radio station in 1922, and radios explode in the 20s. We have all those new electric gadgets, irons and vacuums, and most people who live in those towns and cities in America have electricity in their homes now. Most of them have telephones in their homes now. We get widespread ownership of cars. Do not write everyone had a car, because everyone did not have a car. Everyone does not have a car today. But widespread ownership of automobiles. That creates vacations. That creates motels. What is a motel? Where does that word come from? Motor hotel, exactly. Because you just stay there for the night while you're traveling. America, why do preachers preach against automobiles in the 20s? We're not going to church, we're going for drives on Sundays. And Lord knows what all those teenagers are doing in cars outside of their parents' views. So what preachers are going, one guy called it a brothel on wheels, right?
We're
brothel
prostitutes.
is a house of ill repute. And I can't say any more than that. Look it up. You've got
Where prostitutes work.
Brothels where they make broth.
Guys, I'm glad we're like laughing about brothels and stuff like that, but I can't talk over you, okay? And I've got a ton to do. We see an increase in standard of living, even though supply side economics makes the gap between rich and poor grow significantly. Most of us see an increased standard of living in the 1920s, with the exception of whom? What group of people does not? Who? Farmers. Very good. Farmers do not. Farmers are in the Depression long before the Depression hits, because farmers had overproduced during World War I, and they borrowed money for more land and borrowed money for machinery while they were supplying the Allied forces. And then all of a sudden Europe starts making crops again. The American government doesn't need anything. It doesn't need as much food for troops, and demand goes down. Does that make sense? What other technologies do we have in the 1920s? What? Been here since the 1850s. What?
Washing machine.
Yes, electric washing machines, and remember what they look like. You would put the stuff in there and it would agitate it, and then you'd have to take it out and turn the handle yourself to do what? Put it through the wringer, exactly. So that's when we say I can put through the wringer. That's what that means.
Did we say cars yet?
Yeah, cars, we did. We talked
Okay.
about cars. Refrigeration, we've had refrigeration like in big commercial situations, but now I've got electricity in my home and I can buy an electric ice box, is what they call it. And some of your old grandparents, great-grandparents might still call it the ice box, because that's what people put it in before.
Indoor plumbing.
Without a doubt, we've had indoor plumbing in New York since the 1880s, maybe even before, but most Americans, except these rural people, most Americans have indoor plumbing by this time. So just be careful with your word usage in the 20s for a lot of those things. There are things that have been invented for a long time, but now most Americans have access to them. No AC till after World War II. And again, it's invented before, but hardly anybody has it.
Electric stoves.
Who?
Electric stoves.
Yes, electric stoves, very good. Vacuum cleaners, irons, anything else. Okay, yes. Movies, again, yes. Movies have been invented before, but their popularity explodes in the 20s. And in the very last year of the 20s, what do you get?
Oh, I was gonna say there's, it's not when the talkies came out.
Exactly. Who knows the name of the first talkie?
I know it's the train.
The Jazz Singer is the name of the first talkie. Yes.
Another, like, technology thing, cosmetics for women.
Yes, and again, cosmetics have been around, but who wore cosmetics before World War One?
Nobody, actors.
Actresses, women of ill repute,
Yeah.
right? No nice person did. But now we have this national advertising that can be done on the radio, that can be done in magazines. And so we advertise these things. Y'all remember the video where the woman says women were kind of guilt tripped into making themselves look better. You know, if you don't, your husband's going to look at his new young secretary. You know, is your skin soft enough? Do you have BO?
This isn't necessarily an invention, but weren't more people like coming together to sort of just like dance and listen to sort of party?
I would certainly say this is certainly the era where jazz explodes, things like that. Just be careful about overstating it. I always think about my grandmother, Wilhelmina, God rest her soul. She is a young girl in the late 20s. She lived in Manning, South Carolina. She was not going to jazz clubs. She was not drinking bathtub gin. She was not smoking cigarettes. She never even wore pants in her life until she died of 80-something years old. Her biggest rebellion was cutting her hair because she wanted the bob. And her father said no, that only poors, for what I'm sure that's what he said, would cut their hair, and she sneaked off and cut her hair. That's probably the one rebellion in her life. So,
Why do people think that about hair? Like, where did
I
that even come
can't
from?
explain it. We could, 50 years from now, your grandchildren are going to say weird stuff like that too. I just say that, I tell you Wilhelmina's story because I want you to understand that most people were not flappers. Most women were not flappers. Most people are not, and that's one of those big conflicts we talked about this morning. Modern versus traditional. That was a conflict in the Cochran household that day, over that. But makeup for sure. I'm gonna move on. We do absolutely have increased mobility because of automobiles and trucks. What happens to railroads and the wealth of railroads? They decline greatly. Who's going to ship their goods on railroads if they can ship it in now you're still shipping rocks and lumber because you can't ship those so well in trucks. But a lot of shipping takes over, so railroads see their profits decline. Probably not until the 30s or later, and even then it's very expensive. We also have, as I've mentioned twice, I think, increased communication. Radios, movies, national magazines. We get a national culture. We're all, if Wilhelmina's not going to the jazz club, she's probably sneaking around trying to listen to it on the radio. Does that make sense? So we've got that. We're listening to Amos and Andy comedy show on Friday nights. We have a national culture. We're going to see the same movies if we possibly can on Saturdays. All right, I'm going to move to the Great Depression. You all know those causes: a lack of regulation of banking, a lack of regulation of the stock market, overproduction of goods. We kept producing, and then all of a sudden everybody's got a radio. And so we have warehouses full of radios. So RCA, Radio Corporation of America, has to lay off workers, and then that begins a downward spiral. The stock market crashes because we'd all been borrowing money and investing in the stock market. Don't say we all. Your teacher uses hyperbole, and sometimes you do as a result. Please don't do that. But lots of people are borrowing money, and those stock prices go up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And then all of a sudden they're too high and there's not anybody to buy them. And that's where we get the stock market crash. And so people lost, the United States lost billions of dollars in paper value at that time. We have overproduction of farm goods. We put, that's farm goods. We also put a high tariff. Who knows it from this morning? Fordney McCumber, very good. We put a very high tariff on foreign goods, and so that meant that other countries weren't able to buy our goods. We had no regulations on the banks. They didn't have enough money in reserves, even though we had had a Federal Reserve since 1913 under Wilson, that there weren't still enough regulations of banking. And so we sink into the Great Depression, the worst economic period in American history, hands down. It was far worse than 1893 and on, all of those other ones that we've studied. 25% unemployment. That's, just think about it, look around the room. Imagine if 1/4 of all of your parents were unemployed, and then add to that the undocumentable underemployed. How many people are underemployed? And we know this from 2007 recession, when we had a lot of people who were working jobs making half as much money as they once were. And so they're still employed, they're not in unemployment statistics, but they are underemployed. They do not have as much money to go out and spend at Walmart, or to buy a new car, or all of those things. And so when you've got 25% unemployment, you've got a horrible situation. 6,000 banks went under. And I've told you this before, that's even 80 years later, that's Conway National Bank advertises in their literature that they were the only bank in Horry County to stay open during the Great Depression. That's still a badge of honor among banks, that they were able to, that they had such sound fiscal policy. Socially, you know that if we went out in the 20s, if the 20s roared, in the 30s, we came back home. We predominantly stayed at home and listened to the radio. That was wildly popular. What's the one exception? The movies. Average movie ticket sales in America each week equal the population. I mean, everybody could go, but some people went twice, right? The movies were a place where you could go and escape the horrors. We know that it affected, the Great Depression affected the social fabric of America. While divorce rate goes down, it's one of the very few times, that in the 50s, that I can say a decade where divorce rate goes down. Give me the nuance. Abandonment goes up. People just couldn't afford a divorce during that time. But divorce rate goes down. What happens to high school graduation rates? It goes up. There are no jobs. You might as well stay in school, right? And if there are jobs, there are adults willing to take them. So at the same time, many local communities had to close schools. They had to fire teachers because they didn't have tax revenue to pay those teachers. Or they gave teachers IOUs during this time. We have a return, I think you laughing because you're thinking I wouldn't be here, aren't you, Sabrina? I love you, but no, I probably wouldn't if I'm giving an IOU.
None of the teachers here would, because all of them complain about how they make no money.
Probably. I don't make any money, but I would, okay, I'm digressing. Social fabric. Women are more discriminated against in the workplace. If you have a husband, it's expected that you shouldn't take a job. That when you go out looking for a job, you're taking a job, girls, from a man who needs it to support his family. Does that make sense?
You're a maid.
Right, unless you're in a women's only profession. We see an increase in malnutrition, in rickets, and scurvy, and diseases associated with malnutrition. We see an increase in the number of children put in orphanages. Parents have to abandon their children, not because the parents are dead, but because the parents cannot take care of them. And I think, I know I used to kind of snicker. I had a landlady that lived upstairs over us, and she grew up in the Depression, and she washed out baggies, and she washed her tinfoil and used it again. And she was a multi-millionaire, but she did that, and I would kind of laugh. But the horror that those people grew up in, I shouldn't have. I should have been more sensitive about that, because they went through that horrible, and guys, we have poor people in America today, and we have people that go hungry in America today, but not nearly the numbers. Remember, there was no safety net. There is nothing except hopefully a local charity to help you get food. There is not welfare. There is not Social Security yet. There is not food stamps. There's a school lunch. If you didn't have lunch when you went to school, your parents couldn't afford it, you didn't have lunch that day. That's the reality of the Great Depression. Don't forget the horrors of it.
What about like the poorhouses they had back then? Was that now, or was that in during the New Deal?
They have poorhouses, but they're not government supported. They're supported by charities.
The government supported ones are going to be in the New Deal, right?
I don't know
Because
that.
at one point they decided they would decide who needed help and who like didn't deserve government welfare, like the old people, the sick, the
I
little
believe
kids?
that second statement. I just don't know of a federally funded poorhouse.
Okay.
I'm not saying it didn't exist. I just don't know of it. But that does take us. I always forget this, and I've been teaching this for 20 years. I've been studying it for 40-something years. I want to say the Great Depression happened, and thank God for Franklin Roosevelt. I forget that there is almost a 4-year period, a 3.5-year period of time that Herbert Hoover's president during the Great Depression, not just at the start of it. And he tries some things. He tries to encourage business to not fire people and to not decrease wages and things like that. But it's really not enough. He's just unwilling for the federal government to take on that responsibility. Under the New Deal, obviously you need to know about relief, recovery, and reform, and you need to be able to describe what those are. I would say be able to give an example of each. Okay, relief is I'm putting food in your mouth right now. The government is going to provide that. And the Civilian Conservation Corps is a great one. That the Federal Writers Project. Remember the people who, when we read about View from the Bottom Rail? My kids, y'all remember that? Most of y'all didn't read it and got F's on that and used a free quiz pass. But you should have read it. I might not let free quiz passes go next year because it's a great, we learn two things. We learn about slaves and Reconstruction, and we learn about New Deal programs like the Federal Writers Project. I'm going to make up a job, and I'm going to give you a job so that you can buy groceries. That's relief. Yes, excellent. Steinbeck goes around. He worked for the county of Los Angeles counting dogs, right? John Steinbeck. So we have that's relief. Recovery is what are we going to do to get the country back on its feet? How about the Agricultural Adjustment Act? You're making too much. We're making too much food. Let's pay farmers not to make food, right? That's going to get prices back up on farm goods, which is going to help those people. Does that make sense to everybody? What was the bad side of the Agricultural Adjustment Act?
Was it unconstitutional?
Who produced most of the agricultural products in the South in 1930?
Sharecroppers.
Sharecroppers. Who gets paid not to produce the
Plantation owners.
the property owners get paid that money, and so sharecroppers, already the poorest people in America, are kicked off of the farms because the owner is being paid not to produce. Well, that's kind of saying like you're poor and I'm going to make you poorer. I'm going to help you by making you poorer. Does that make sense? And that's where we get like the people of the Dust Bowl are hurt by all of this. They go out west. The Okies go out west. Reform, a great example of reform is the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. That still today regulates banks and stocks and those kinds of things. So relief, recovery, and reform. Some things that the College Board said you need to know is that the programs of the New Deal are not all Franklin Roosevelt. That he was actually kind of pushed forward by labor unions, by his coalition, by radicals, that you've got to do something. One of the big historical debates is, was the New Deal a good thing? And people who say it wasn't a good thing say, number one, it didn't get us out of the Depression. And number two, it made the government responsible for the welfare of the people. And now we're spending all of these billions every year on welfare, and we still have poor people. That it didn't end poverty in America. That it made government too big. I don't know. That's a philosophical question. We don't have time to answer today. We might disagree on what the welfare of the people means. Does that make sense to you? Some people say that means a common defense. It doesn't mean putting food in your mouth. That's outside the realm of the federal government. people who say the New Deal succeeded was they look at the reduction of the poverty in the New Deal. They look at the fact that we have far fewer people living in poverty today than we once did. Does that make sense? They talk about the efforts by New Deal, even though we know they failed overall to bring about opportunities for African Americans, the Native American New Deal, the position of women in the New Deal, even though we know the New Deal was flawed in those areas, that there were segregated towns in the Tennessee Valley Authority and things like that, we know that it was a step forward. You also must know the New Deal coalition. It is Southern whites who've always been Democratic up until this time. Southern white farmers.
Little D Democrats or big D Democrats?
I'm big D Democrats, the Democratic Party. Labor union activists and labor union members and African Americans. And I need you to be able to understand, how can I have a party of racist people from down here and African Americans? What's the answer? Race is not the biggest political issue yet. It's just like abolition. How can I have a Whig party in the 1840s where Zach Taylor, a plantation owner, and Henry David Thoreau, a fervent abolitionist, are both Whigs? How can I have that? Because slavery is not the biggest issue yet. And that's this. This New Deal coalition is going to hang together for the Democrats through the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to push, if that's the right word, these white Southern conservatives out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. Does that make sense? Yes? No? We got that? Do you know the New Deal coalition? Give me evidence of New Deal support of labor unions. What's the act that says labor unions are okay, business owners can't investigate them? No, that's the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act. The Fair Labor and Standards Act set a national minimum wage and set how long you can people can work, and said no child labor, children under the age of whatever. So that's also from this time, and that's definitely
Your forehead takes up most of my screen.
that's definitely something labor unions like. They wanted children out of the factories because that raises the wages of other people. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. If I were you, I would go back and I would make in my memorization, one of the things I would memorize is I would have relief, recovery, and reform, and I'd have my examples of it. And I would also have go from first and second New Deal. And make sure you have at least one thing from there. First New Deal, we know that's all the 100-day stuff. The Banking Act, the banking holiday, all that kind of stuff. No Social Security because it's lasting today. When they created Social Security, it was brilliant because who pays for Social Security? The current workers' taxes do. My Social Security that I hopefully will one day get 13 years from now, that Social Security is not my money. It's not the money I've invested and put in. It's the money that you all and your children will be working on to pay for my retirement.
You're welcome.
And that, thank you. That is brilliant because by God, I'm going to get my Social Security. Nobody who's older is going to vote to get rid of Social Security. Does that make sense to you? Because I've been paying for it since I was 15 years old. Almost 40 years. I deserve my Social Security. You see me get mad? Okay, so imagine that. And then we add, what's the other major entitlement program that we add in the 60s? Medicare for old people also. And you know it. You want to get your grandparents or great-grandparents riled up, go talk. I heard they about to end Medicare, Grandma, and they'll start like spitting their dentures out and stuff.
How do you compare the Great Society to the New Deal?
We are going to do that. That had been my plan today had I finished period 7. I'm going to have an entire day, and it's probably going to be one of our days next week, where I'm going to go through the reform movements. We're going to do Jacksonian / antebellums. Then we're going to do the progressives again briefly. Then we'll do the New Deal, and then we'll do the 1960s. And we'll compare and contrast those 4 major reform movements. Would you do two things for me? Number one, first of all, time out, we got a minute or two. Everybody who didn't have me today, we are not having a Thursday session because of a Scholar Squad meeting, so we will have a Friday session. It won't be as long.